Hi, students. We're going to talk about our first social ethics issue, and we're going to be looking at two very opposite philosophical views about poverty. So by the end of this, you should be able to recognize facts about global and relative poverty, be able to explain and assess Peter Singer's utilitarian reasoning and claims about moral duties towards the poor, particularly to be able to explain and assess Singer's drowning child thought experiment, then be able to explain and assess John Arthur's rights argument against Singer's position and reasoning, and be able to explain and assess Arthur's kidney eye donation thought experiment, as well as his lazy farmer, industrious farmer thought experiment. So what is poverty? Poverty is a condition of lacking basic human needs, such as nutrition, clean water, health care, clothing, and shelter, because of the inability to afford them. So for absolute or extreme poverty, we're talking about being poor compared to the whole of the Earth's human population. So for that, 648 million people, or 8% of the global population, live in extreme poverty, meaning they subsist on less than $2.15 per day. Half the world's population subsists on less than or equal to $6.85 a day. Children in poverty is of main concern. Over half of the 659 million of the absolute poor are children. 3 million children a year die from lack of basic resources. For those who survive childhood poverty, 1 in 3 are permanently affected. Chronic undernourishment can stunt mental and physical development. So that's absolute poverty. We're going to talk about relative poverty in the United States, which at this moment is the wealthiest nation on earth. So the average American spends $185 a day, and the median wealth is over $120,000. Less than 0.25% of people live in a condition of extreme poverty. So live on less than 2.15 a day. Relative poverty refers to lacking the minimum amount of income needed to maintain the average standard of living in the society in which they live. So the relatively poor in America still might have TVs, they might have access to school lunches or to other means of food banks, to both private and public resources and nonprofit resources to be able to subsidize their income. But that's what we mean by relatively poor, is somebody who is lacking the minimum amount of income needed to maintain the average standard of living in the society in which they live here in the US now. So the US federal poverty threshold for one is $14,580, and for a family of 4, $30,000. Virginia is ranked 6th for economic climate in the US out of the 50 states, and 10th for the lowest poverty rates. It's got 8.6 million people in 2023, and the Virginians in poverty then were 9.5%. Individuals in poverty enrichment were 19.8%, whereas in Chesterfield County, it's only 6.8%. That's actually not unusual to see more wealth in the suburbs and in the inner cities. So we can look at this is a map of the different states with different poverty rates, with Virginia at 9.5%, which is similar to Oregon. And we can see California has a 12.5% poverty rate, which is close to New York State and also to Florida. So global poverty. Social ethics is the realm of applied ethics that considers social moral problems. And so our social ethics issue number one is global poverty. So the question is really, do people particularly in the United States, where many people are relatively wealthy, do people have duties to help the global poor? So first, we're going to make sure that you understand the facts of what counts as relatively poor in the US versus globally poor. So true or false, if you earn $14,000 a year in the US, then you count as being in absolute poverty. True or false, in Virginia, more people are relatively poor in the city of Richmond than in Chesterfield County. True or false, most people in absolute poverty are children. True or false, Virginia is not the poorest state. All right, so our battle royale this week is ding, 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 Singer versus Arthur. So we've got John Arthur on the right and Peter Singer on the left. We're going to start with Singer. He gives a pretty strong conclusion that we have duties to the global poor if we have a certain amount of income, if we are relatively wealthy. So to start off, let me just explain that what Singer is giving here and what you have all read is a consequentialist argument. The foundation for judging if an act is moral is whether the consequence alleviates suffering and promote the good for all concerned. He notes that extreme poverty causes suffering, disabilities, and deaths. Aid is required from wealthy nations and wealthy individuals for people to get out of extreme poverty. Peter Arthur, on the other hand, gives a rights argument. The foundation for judging the moral obligation of an act, obligatoriness, meaning must you do this act, is whether one has an obligation to do something or others have a right to expect one's conduct. Since no one has a positive right to one's services or goods without a contract, Arthur argues that Singer's standard that aid is required from wealthy nations and individuals expects too much. Singer is a preference utilitarian, meaning he focuses on the interests of all beings capable of suffering, following Bentham. Altruism is caring for others selflessly or against one's own non-moral interests. Effective altruism is a social project of using best scientific methods and evidence for solving the most pressing social problems. So active learning exercise, true or false, effective altruism is caring selflessly for others. The reason I bring this up is that Singer is very influential in the effective altruism circles. In particular, he introduced something that is a new ethical principle called the principle of equal consideration of interests. And this is to mark his brand of preference utilitarianism. It has two parts. One should include all affected interests when calculating the rightness of an action. Two, those interests should be weighed equally. So suppose an office manager wants to create a schedule that fairly distributes shifts to their psychologists for the week. Using the principle of equal consideration of interests, true or false, it's morally permissible for the manager to treat one psychologist's preferred days as less important than another psychologist's preferences. True or false, it is morally permissible for the manager to ignore the interests of his neighbors since they are not affected by the shift schedule. True or false, it is morally permissible for the manager to ignore one's psychologist's preferences. So in Famine, Affluence, and Morality, Peter Singer famously, in his first paragraph, begins by bringing up which becomes a typical crisis involving starvation. In this case, refugees in East Bengal in 1971. He introduces this crisis to point out that many lack basic nutrition in the world, while people who have affluence are aware of that situation and do little or nothing to help. Hold on one sec, let me sip. Pardon me. The way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified. I've got an image of the actual refugee crisis in 1971, and it was a serious problem. So active reflection, think about the news right now. Where in the world is there a food crisis due to war, drought, extreme weather events, or other causes? So if you are poor, being poor increases infant mortality rates, decreases life expectancy, is related to illiteracy, and causes poor development in children. The absolute poor, Singer notes, are severely deprived human beings struggling to survive in a set of squalid and degraded circumstances. So here's his core argument. First, suffering or death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. If one can prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, then one ought to do that. Absolute poverty is bad. We can prevent some absolute poverty without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. Therefore, we ought to prevent poverty. Okay, so just go through this again. Suffering, death, bad. One can prevent death and suffering without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, then one should sacrifice that. Absolute poverty is bad, and we can prevent some absolute poverty without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. Therefore, we ought to prevent poverty. Now, Singer argues directly against the moral relevance of proximity. So I want you to think about this yourself. So active reflection exercise on proximity. Does one have limited or no obligations to people who are not physically, geographically, or culturally tied to you? Does physical distance create moral distance? Why or why not? Conversely, does one have a duty to prosperity based on duties to those who are close to you? In other words, does one have a duty to strive to be wealthy for your closest people and community? If so, on what is that duty based? If not, why not? So let's talk about duty versus charity. Singer argues this traditional distinction between duty and charity cannot be drawn, or at least not in the place we normally draw it. Normally, charity is considered supererogatory. Sorry, I lost my place. So it's above and beyond the call of duty. Singer says, looking stylish when you know people are starving and you could contribute instead of buying new stylish clothes is immoral. It makes you morally blameworthy. The rebuttal to it is not morally condemned to not give to charity. So, quote, most people reserve their moral condemnation for those who violate some moral norms, such as the norm against taking another person's property. They do not condemn those who indulge in luxury instead of giving to famine relief. Singer just says, look, where am I going wrong in my argument? So he's challenging for a rebuttal there. And he offers a rebuttal to the no rest objection directly. He says, some may say it asks too much of human decency towards too much of human decency to contribute towards global poverty. It is human behavior that should be the object of that criticism, not a standard for alleviating the main cause of suffering on earth. In other words, he's saying, look, the objection that it's asking too much of human decency is a problem with human decency. It's not a problem with asking too much. He says, look, there's the case of absolute affluence. So just as we have absolute poverty, we have people who have more than enough to cover their basic need. He thinks absolutely wealthy people choose their food for the pleasure of the palate, not to stop hunger. They buy their new clothes to look good, not to keep warm. They move house to be in a better neighborhood, not to keep out the rain. And after all this, there's still money to spend on stereo systems, video cameras, and overseas holidays. So Singer argues that because rich individuals in rich countries refuse to give to the absolutely poor, people in rich countries are allowing those in poor countries to suffer from absolute poverty with the consequent malnutrition, ill health, and death. It clarifies that this applies to individuals who fail to give adequately as well as government. His standard is 10% of one's income should be used to reduce poverty ideally. So active reflection. Is Singer right that it's morally required to give up luxuries to aid the poor, and that spending money on stylish clothes when one knows children die from malnourishment is morally blameworthy? Why or why not? He gives a thought experiment I want you to actively reflect upon. This is called the drowning child thought experiment. There's an image of a professor looking in the water like he's about to leap in. Quote, I am walking past a shallow pond and I see a child drowning in it. I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of a child would presumably be a very bad thing. Do you agree or disagree that this example shows one should follow this moral principle that if one can help, one should? Does a child drowning thought experiment support the claim that the wealthy have a duty to alleviate suffering caused by global poverty? Why or why not? Now we're going to move on to John Arthur's response in World Hunger and Moral Obligation. He's arguing directly against Peter Singer's famine, affluence, morality, and that particularly that we should not buy luxuries when others are in severe need. And he says, nah, that is not correct. The way that Arthur argues against it is he calls one of Singer's assumptions the, quote, greater moral evil rule. If we can prevent greater suffering, we should, is the way he reclassifies or recharacterizes Singer's assumption. Arthur objects to this assumption. He says this principle implies that people are entitled to keep their earnings only if there's no way for them to prevent a greater evil by giving them away. Providing others with food, clothing, and housing would generally be of more importance than buying luxuries, so the greater moral evil rule now requires substantial redistribution of wealth. He also thinks the greater moral evil rule, again, if we can prevent suffering, greater suffering than we should, implies the moral irrelevance of rights and deserts. He uses a donation thought experiment, which I created a little cartoon for. where it says, donate an eye for the blind. And the guy says, I don't think I must donate an eye. The woman says, well, what about a kidney? So let's do the donation thought experiment that John Arthur presents to argue as a rebuttal against or a criticism to Singer's utilitarian arguments about poverty. So suppose one is presented the opportunity to donate a kidney or an eye to someone who desperately needs it. One may freely donate, but Arthur argues the greater moral evil rule requires one to sacrifice a body part. Arthur says, quote, obviously such things are unpleasant, but according to the greater moral evil rule, that is not enough. To be justified in refusing, you must show that the unpleasantness you would experience is of equal importance to the harm you are preventing. Arthur says, look, it's completely counterintuitive to normal moral codes. Our codes do not require such heroism. We are entitled to keep our second eye and kidney. The reason for this is often expressed in terms of rights. He concludes that sacrificing to strangers is supererogatory, meaning above and beyond the call of duty, rather than morally required. Which are reasons Arthur gives against Singer? A, his expectations morally are counterintuitive. Singer expects substantial redistribution of wealth. His argument implies the moral importance of virtue. It implies there is no moral relevance of desert. It implies one might be morally required to donate one's body parts if it makes somebody else's life substantially better. So I want you to think about these thought experiments. Is Arthur's donating a kidney or an eye thought experiment a good objection to Singer's greater moral evil rule, or one of the basic premises he puts into his argument? Why or why not? Consider A, Singer saving a drowning child by jumping in a lake and muddying one's clothes. To B, Arthur's being required to donate a kidney or eye. Do these examples correlate well to requiring wealthy individuals or nations to donate money to help prevent or alleviate suffering or poverty? So are they analogous? So Arthur is interested in rights and in desert. So let's just go back over negative rights and positive rights. Negative rights are, again, rights of non-interference and are based normally, according to many rights theorists, on natural rights. So the way humans are and the way the world is. Positive rights are rights of recipients and based normally on promises or contracts. So if somebody has a right to a good or service done unto them, only if somebody else has an obligation or made a promise or created a contract. So Arthur argues that a duty to help a stranger in need is not the result of a right that that stranger has. Such a right would be positive, and since no contract or promise was made, no such right exists. Arthur argues that Singer overlooks the concept of moral desert. Desert meaning deserving of. So moral desert means blaming people for their moral inactions and praising them for their moral actions because they deserve praise. So he gives a final thought experiment of the industrious farmer versus the lazy farmer. So he imagines an industrious farmer who manages through his hard work to produce a surplus of food for the winter, while his lazy neighbor spends his summer fishing. And I've created a image of the fisherman and the sleeping fisherman to indicate the industrious versus the lazy. Now, the question he asks is, should the industrious farmer give his own surplus to the lazy farmer's family simply because they are in need? Arthur is arguing here that Singer's account fails to consider moral desert. And rights and deserts are entitlements, and are thus representing backward-looking considerations that are completely ignored by Singer's consequentialist approach. Arthur says desert, like rights, is backward-looking, emphasizing past effort or past transgressions, which now warrant reward or punishment. He holds that our moral code requires considering both the past and the future in one's calculation of moral requirements. Okay, so demonstrate your reading comprehension. Explain in detail Singer versus Arthur in the two articles you read on poverty. Make sure you show how closely you read the text. What do each conclude about the duty to alleviate global poverty for wealthy individuals? Do your own utilitarian or rights reasoning. Is the best approach to considering the moral problem focusing on non-interference with autonomy or with minimizing human suffering? Explain your moral reasoning. Now create your own virtue ethics reasoning. Create your own virtue ethics argument on whether a typical wealthy Virginian household of one making over 80,000 is morally required to help prevent and alleviate global poverty by donating some of their money. Give multiple reasons supporting your position on how a decently generous person, or ideally generous, is required to behave to prevent global poverty, if at all. Now I want you to match the philosopher to their thought experiment. So we've got Bentham, Thompson, Mill, Arthur, Singer, Hobbes, Rousseau, Paley, and Grotius. First, the Industrious versus a lazy farmer thought experiment, child drowning in a lake example, transplant surgeon and traveler thought experiment, donating one's kidney or eye example, Pushman versus poetry example, Socrates dissatisfied versus pig satisfied example, desert island thought experiment, locked doors and chess thought experiment. I have to admit, I don't think I told you that Judith Jarvis Thompson wrote The Transplant Surgeon and and the Traveler Thought Experiment, but I'm going to give you that one if I skipped it or I didn't write it in the notes. But that's it. Thanks so much.